Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. In order for communism to succeed in the West, a massive deconstruction, a demolishing of the culture would have to have occurred. However, the commies were not operating in a vacuum, and they knew that. You can't just blow into town and start uprooting everything and blowing it all up. Perhaps a better way to visualize this would be to think in terms of tipping scales. When one side is greatly lower, more weight on it, you can get the scales to tip by either just adding much more weight to the other side or slowly adding that weight to the other side while at the same time subtracting weight from the opposite side. They start to move. Of course, the second method requires more time and patience and planning, but at the end, it is the more effective way to actually flip the scales. This was the plan the communists put into effect in America. Ultimately, it was all about transforming society slowly, methodically, and extremely effectively, so that as one generation just sort of melded in and gave way to the next, the transformation would hardly be noticeable at all. It was an extremely ambitious and, most importantly, a wide-ranging strategy, one that required capturing various institutions of society at approximately the same time. If you think in terms of, say, planning a great big meal, a Thanksgiving dinner, for example, with all sorts of dishes and side dishes and the whole bit, you need to make sure that the timing is right. All the food has to hit the table at the same time. But because they're different dishes, some require a lot of advanced prep work, others maybe not so much. But they all need to come out of the stove, off the stove and out of the oven at just about the same instant. Well, the same is true of the commie plan to undermine the culture. What all the institutions actually had in common was their at least tacit acceptance of Christian principles, and specifically Catholic principles on how a well-ordered society should run and look. Antonio Gramsci clashed with Joseph Stalin on the issue of what was the greater challenge to creating the workers' paradise, capitalism or the Catholic Church. For Gramsci, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, whom we talked about earlier this week, it was clear to him it was Catholicism because he understood the vital knitting together of the other institutions that relied on the underlying view of man promoted and taught by the Catholic Church. The anthropology of Catholicism. Who is man? What is his purpose? And what therefore flows from those answers is the canvas upon which society is painted. The texture of the paintings, the canvas, the nap of it, the material, all of that gives a certain view of the final piece of art. Well, so too with the church, which, like it or not, even here in Protestant America, set the tone for everything else. Stalin's method of installing communism was much more forceful: violence, rebellion, suppression, mass murders, ultimately ruling through fear. It would produce immediate results, sure enough, check that box, if it was successful, enslaving many nations, but the question of its staying power, that was indeed a question. Stalin's new Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, did indeed steamroll its way through much of the 20th century, asserting its dominance on hundreds of millions behind the Iron Curtain, threatening world peace almost continuously for roughly 40 years, but then it simply vanished almost overnight. On Christmas night, 1991, President of the Soviet Union, which had already largely disintegrated, Mikhail Gorbachev gave a 10-minute resignation speech. Moments later, the hammer and sickle Soviet Communist flag, which had flown there for 70 years, was lowered, and the new Russian flag was raised. In the run-up to that breathless moment, almost 2 years earlier, in what would have been formerly understood as impossible, Gorbachev went to the Vatican, hat in hand, and posed with Pope John Paul II for a photo op. The world was stunned. The leader of godless atheism that had tortured and murdered countless Catholics behind that Iron Curtain, who many say had a finger in the role of trying to assassinate John Paul, including many of John Paul's closest friends, was now standing there at the throne of Peter, hoping to impress Western bankers from whom he needed much financing, that things had indeed changed in the Kremlin. The Pope likes me. Isn't this great? Can you give us big, giant loans? That scene in December 1989, followed 2 years later by the flag lowering over the Kremlin in December 1991, proved that Antonio Gramsci had been correct. No empire ruled by fear and oppression can last indefinitely. The foundational philosophy needs to be transformed, not thrown into camps and murdered. Human bodies could be crushed, yes, but human nature cannot. But what human nature can be is manipulated and transformed, twisted further. Gramsci got it. The institution that needed to be attacked and transformed was the Catholic Church, because it pointed to the heights, directed human nature to its greater end, and it's that foundation with its appeal to justice and kindness and charity that all society was built upon, not perfectly, of course, but still built upon. The church preached that to the barbarians more than 1,000 years earlier and had never stopped. Those preachings and teachings were the very bedrock of the West, and as long as the institution which kept them in place was itself in place, communism didn't stand a chance, except for a momentary period of violence and oppression that could not last. Key to the advancement of communism would be the undermining of Catholicism because of its complete and total embrace and upholding of Christianity. Protestantism didn't pose a threat to communism, never has, because large portions had already abandoned the bedrock principles regarding human nature. Gramsci proves the point: the battle is between Catholicism and atheism, which today thrives in communism. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.